Hi everyone, and welcome to the Coerver Coaching Podcast. My name is Jimmy Galusi, and I'll be your host today. I'm here today with two gentlemen, one of which is my father, Alfred. Alf, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here today. And we're also very lucky to be here with Dr. Peter Bain, who is going to have a fascinating conversation with us today. A little bit background on the conversation today. My dad, Alf, and Pete are good friends and have been meeting really over the last, 10 years, Dad?
12 years.
12 years regularly for a coffee. And some of the conversations that they've had are absolutely incredible. And I feel very lucky to sort of be privy to those and understand a little bit about what they're talking. So the purpose of today's podcast is really to give you guys, the audience, an understanding and insight to some of the fascinating things that they talk about. So before we get into the topic of the podcast today, I'm just going to introduce the guys a little bit more and ask them also to talk about sort of what they're into and a little bit about their histories. So kick the ball over to you first, Dad. Can you tell us a little bit about your coaching background and also sort of what you're passionate about outside of coaching and as it relates to the conversation with Dr. Pete today?
Yes, well, it's now 40 years since Charlie Cook and myself founded a program called Coerver Coaching. And it's really a program devised for coaches, players, parents to improve player performance. I've worked with 51 professional clubs around the world, including Juventus, Manchester City, Bayern Munich, etc., which has given me a lot of insights, and I feel very lucky for that, and 17 national federations. So these 40 years, I guess one thing I've learned is that the more I learn, the more I understand that I have to learn more, or I don't know. So meeting Peter was just one of the most important parts of my 40-year career, because I've been a skills coach or a so-called skills specialist for these 40 years. And when I met Dr. Bain, it actually not persuaded me, but it ticked the boxes that had been missing for me. How do we learn skills? How can we help players of all sports improve their skills? So it's fantastic to have this now recorded between us, what we've been talking about 12 years. My interest basically is in the fact that football mainly is so much bigger than just a sport. I've worked in 27 countries. It's a language. It's a religion in a way, and it can do so much more than just being a game. And I guess that's for the remainder of my career. I'd like to explore how we can use football education, football communication to improve everybody's lives, not only on the football field. And again, Dr. Bain has added tremendously to my sort of goal to achieving that.
And over these years, obviously, you've had a close relationship and friendship with Dr. Bain, and that's probably evolved in terms of the way you've thought about those topics that you discussed. Is there one singular thing where the penny dropped after all these years, where it's really been very impactful to how you're thinking about the game and development of the game?
Yeah, so in football, there's 4 or 5 essential skills: running with the ball, passing, shooting, 1v1. And so in Coerver, Charlie and I, when we started 40 years ago, we devised a curriculum. You can imagine how expansive it is now. But it was basically to improve individual player skills. But one thing, because Charlie and I, our background was in football, was we knew it was a team game. So we knew that there had to be decision-making was a very important thing, just rather than just teaching the skill. We had to, when we devised drills and games, add that DNA, if you like, of decision-making. And then, of course, meeting with Peter, decision-making is a mental process. And so I think that changed then how we devised not only drills, but session plans. So that was the
key thing.
Yeah, key.
And Dr. Pete, if I kick the ball over to you, Could you tell us a little bit, firstly, about your medical background and then get into your interest in football?
Yes, so my medical background was that I went to Oxford University as an undergraduate, and part of my medical degree in Oxford University was in physiology, which is really how the body works. And that has become a huge area in sports science. So what used to be physiology departments are really now sports science departments. So that gave me a very big interest in the understanding of how the body works under stressful situations like in sport. Then I've been a doctor working as a doctor for over 40 years, and I've been over 30 years as a consultant now in neurology, and I've been head of teaching of neurology at Imperial College London. I lecture all over the world about tremors, human tremors, and movement disorders or abnormal movements. And of course, that gives you a very sharp eye on how people move. And of course, that's the bad end. So when people are not moving normally because they have a problem with some movement. And the good end is how people move well when they play sport.
Right.
So people who play different sports have great movement. Let's just take, say, Roger Federer in tennis. His movement around the course is fantastic. Anyone who saw Thierry Henry running on a football pitch immediately realizes there's an incredible smoothness and beauty to the movement. And so I became very appreciative of human movement, both good and bad. And I published well over 150 research papers, 3 books. I've written 25 book chapters for other authors all around the world. And also have been, apart from the kind of neurology and pure medicine, many years ago I joined the European College of Sports Science because that was my original interest within medicine. And of course that has been a fantastic forum for me to learn more about various aspects of all kinds of sport. And interestingly, at the same Congress, they look at the importance of exercise and movement in the rehabilitation and basic human health. So both aspects are very critical, I think, to understanding sport in a more holistic way.
Pete, you mentioned the sort of gracefulness of athletes like Roger Federer, and maybe Zinedine Zidane would be the one that comes to mind in football. Yeah. Could you, from a layman's perspective, just give us a little bit of insight on actually what's going on? Why does a player like Zidane move in a more graceful way than another player? Can you tell us what's happening there? How has that kind of come to be?
Yeah, so I think it's what one might say, if you're looking at it visually, it's a question of flow. They have a superior flow. And I think that flowing movement that they have is almost certainly due to better timing of the movements of every single joint. So when the knee moves, the ankle moves, the arms move, it's much more neatly timed. Right. And actually we looked at that in a study that got published in karate players. So we looked at karate players punching a bag, and they had infrared markers on. We were measuring the force and studying the interjoint flow. So we had markers on their shoulder, elbow, wrist, hip, legs, various things. And of course they punched the bag. We compared 20 black belts to 20 good athletes who didn't do karate. And what we found, of course, they hit the bag harder, a lot harder. Of course, they hit the bag many more times per second. So that was good. But the critical thing was that the timing between the joints was much, much more accurate. Right. So whereas with the amateurs, there was looseness in the timing. So at one point, it could be a certain timing between the shoulder moving and then the elbow opening. In the karate pose, it was very, very precise and much closer together. So if you imagine a rocket taking off, with the amateurs, and it had 3 stages to the rocket, with the amateurs, it would take off, and then bang, the second stage would go, and then bang, the third stage would go. But in the karate pose, it was bang, bang, bang. No, it was just the timing between the 3 joints moving was so much tighter. So I think what gives them that grace is the purity of the timing of the movements. And actually, I think flow as a movement has not been well studied. And actually, it's one of the things I'm actually thinking about scientifically, is how we can study that flow better.
Really interesting. And it's also, I think, funny, particularly in sort of football and sports like that, where people instantly recognize it, even to the untrained eye. Yeah. It's immediately like a thing that stands out. I remember we went to watch Roger Federer at Wimbledon, Dad, and just how he covered laterally the baseline, left and right, and made it look so effortless for a big man, how he covered that. And Zidane's the obvious football kind of comparison as well.
And Messi, I would say, too.
But wouldn't you say Messi's a bit more, he's different in terms of comparing him to those two athletes because of his explosiveness and his stop-startness? I wouldn't say do you think he's as graceful as those kind of athletes?
With Messi, I keep going back to the mental side. He's so intelligent. I mean, he sees what needs to be done next. He's what in Coerver we say a what's next player. I mean, what do you think, Pete? Because
I'd agree with both of you in a funny way.
Yeah.
So I agree with Jimmy when he was at his best, say with Barcelona. He was extremely explosive. So he would walk around, do nothing, and then explode.
Yeah.
But when you watch him when he was a 5-year-old, I don't know if you've seen the videos, he was unbelievably graceful. He was just running through all the kids. Like, literally, he had that flow.
And very efficient, Pete, in that footage when he's younger, how he's touching the ball actually quite relatively a few times, but so effective in what he was doing.
Yeah, and the timing of the timing, touches, even as a 5-year-old, was tremendous. So he had that underlying grace from a very early age. But what he seemed to add as he got older was just this explosive acceleration that you've mentioned. So I think there's a difference between the young Messi and the Barcelona Messi. Mm-hmm. But I think the explosion is built on a beautiful pattern of movement.
But also there's mental explosion, wasn't it? Because he sees things like that pass in the World Cup. I mean, how does he see things so quickly?
Which pass are you talking about?
The pass that made the second goal against Holland.
In the Qatar World Cup.
In the recent World Cup. And again, my interest, of course, is in the skills on how does a player acquire such skills, and we'll talk about it, and it's probably well known how you develop skills, but I'm fascinated is how he thinks so quickly.
Yeah, so when I watched him live at Barcelona, I was lucky to watch him live at the San Siro. He used to stand around the right touchline.
Right.
And he was just looking at the game. He just spent his time looking at the game. Really, I'm not even walking, I'd say, most of the time just standing there. And then he would begin to get a little bit active. And then he would see something. And it would just be like you would see a tiger or a lion go after a prey into that space. So a very explosive action. But he was always scanning around. And I think the best example I remember is he played at White Hart Lane against Tottenham. And it's a game when he hit the post twice. Now, you would think that Tottenham would appreciate, and I'm certain they did, that Messi's a good player. But he was in acres of space. I mean, there was nobody within 20 yards of him when he received the ball. He just kept finding, quarter of a pitch worth of space for himself. And I was just thinking, how is he doing this? Or how are they missing this?
Yes.
But he had this brilliant ability. And I don't think he had a better game than that. I mean, he absolutely destroyed them in that game. And all the time, there wasn't a person close to him. It was just incredible how he did it. So his scanning and observation of space and then getting into it and exploiting it is I think, part of his genius. But I think that beautiful movement that he had as a kid is also part of it as well.
And Pete, so I coach a under 10 grassroots team, my son's team, and at that age group, their strengths are becoming apparent. Are they physically strong? Are they good passes? Are they good at 1v1? Are they good dribblers? All those things become apparent at that age group, I think, in a more obvious way. One of the kids on the team has this ability to see things that other kids don't. That is his strength. He sees the pictures. He can make killer passes. He can keep the ball. He sees areas that we should be in and shouldn't. How has a player like that acquired that ability at a young age? Is that something that's just within, or is that something that is connected, in your opinion, to some sort of intelligence, maybe out the pitch, or Could you talk a little bit about that?
So I think you can train scanning, and we'll come into that later, because I think this is the big area that the Coerver are moving into now. But I think it does depend on what the person does. So I suspect that if you live in a situation where you have to be vigilant all the time, then you're likely to be looking around. So, for example, I would say that when I'm cycling, so I've done 20,000 kilometers in the last 2 years, I have to be careful of the cars, even pedestrians walking onto the street with their mobiles. And so I've learnt to be very vigilant and constantly taking my shoulder, remembering the very basis of when you pull out, looking left, right, left, which most of Britain have lost now. And just absolutely checking, listening to every noise behind me. I don't wear earplugs or earphones to listen to music when I'm cycling, because I realise I have to be constantly aware if I want to be safe. And so I think the environment you're in actually does, to some extent, develop that. Now obviously, to some extent, you can coach that. But I also think that there's perhaps a personality issue. Now, in the Western world at the moment, we think that attention deficit disorder is a disorder. But say you were a scout in Africa, on the plains, and you were having to watch out for wild animals, and like the kids there, the Maasai kids are looking after the cattle, raiders and all this sort of thing. You wouldn't be looking down at the ground. You would be looking around all the time. And so what may now be a problem in the West may have been a huge benefit in that situation, and perhaps is a benefit on the football pitch.
Right. Fantastic. Oh, that's really interesting. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I think this whole topic of teaching skill, and then being able to help the player in whatever sport use it at the right time, right place, and that's a topic which we call scanning. Peter's already raised that. I think it's a huge topic, and I think that's something that I've always thought, how do you explain in football, which is a team game, why isolated practice is so important? In other words, repeating things, constantly repeating things. To your point, where you've got a 10-year-old who sees other players and can pick their pass, they do that because they've wired, if you like, and Peter will explain it better than I do, the skill of passing, so they don't have to think about it. So their brain opens up and they see 3 or 4 different options to pass. If they didn't have that skill, they'd be struggling to control the ball. I come watch all my grandkids play, and looking at grassroots football, and of course I work in professional academies, the difference between those players, but it's still the same. Once you've got the skill, then you've got the time. And then once you've got the time, you see spaces, you see options. And it goes back to, for example, one of the things that we try to do is help coaches be more effective coaches. Well, and I'm interested on the practice field. Well, then it goes back to the DNA of that drill. Can you devise a drill on the practice field that will, not artificially, but will give the player the opportunity to have all these options of decision making? But then it goes back to, and why I think Coerver is so effective, is without the ability to receive the ball, to control the ball, to run with the ball, to shoot. Decision making becomes almost not redundant, but not as effective.
Yes.
So it goes back to, well, the foundation is skill, but in a team game, you've got to go to the mental side.
Right. I think that at its core, that's the brilliance of Coerver, is that it makes sense. It's absolutely logical that you would need to do that, build those blocks first before getting into, okay, how do we use them? So I think that's at the core. That's why Coerver one of the reasons why Coerver is so brilliant. Before we get on to today's topic, which is really looking at this mental component in sport and how we can start thinking about it and the conversation around it that could help people that are listening. Pete, we talked a little bit about your medical background. Can you talk a little bit about your other passions outside of your sort of career, including football, but the other things that you're into as well? Because knowing a bit about you, I think the listeners would find that fascinating.
Yeah, so I was born in Hong Kong, or as I put it, made in Hong Kong, because my dad was in the Air Force in Hong Kong at the time. And then I came to England at about the age of 9 to go to school. And I think probably because of the change in cultures, I was a bit backward. So, for example, in Hong Kong, we use decimals like we do now in England. But in England, at the time I came in, there were it was a non-decimal system.
Right.
So you had pounds, shillings, and pence. And of course, trying to do maths for kids in that sort of scenario, when I was used to what might be called a much more straightforward system used all around the world now, struck me as really weird.
Right.
And then I couldn't quite understand it, because when I was in Hong Kong, I'd go down into the harbour with my older brothers, and we would look at all the American battleships that were resting there from the Vietnam War, like the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier, huge battleships, and were just stunned by these things. And then when I came to England, and in history, they didn't seem to be interested at all in anything like that, just about King Henry VIII and his wives. And I thought, God, these English people, they're completely nuts. Who on the earth would want to learn this rubbish? When this is going on around the world,
Right now.
Right now,
Yeah.
And I just thought, what are these people up to with this weird maths and total interest in nothing? And so that was pretty tricky. And so I couldn't really motivate myself to work for that kind of stuff, and was really not good at school. So about the age of 16, I was told, never get to university, etc. And then I was made captain of sport. And that gave me a big lift and a great motivation. And also partly because I was very tactical. So there were a lot of better athletes. We had a couple of guys who ran in the Olympics. So Neil Leach and Tim Hutchings ran in the Olympics. But I was a very tactical person in terms of sport. And so I kind of thought a lot about it even at that stage. But luckily, that really gave a lift to my academic performance, and we can come into why that might be later on. And so I ended up going to Oxford to study medicine, which is probably the hardest university to get into and the hardest subject to get into at that time.
So you went from a situation in 2 years of probably not going to university or having a chance to going to the best university or one of them in the world.
Yeah.
How did that happen over such a short period of time?
Yeah, and I just think that actually sport does teach you something else, which is discipline.
Right.
And also that you just get better doing it day after another, And once you apply that, say, to work, then that's what does it. And
that penny dropped.
That penny dropped,
right.
yeah. So that it was nothing to do with me or my qualities. It was due to your persistent work rate and not getting demoralized if something went wrong. And like, say, in sport, you lose a game, not falling to pieces. Realize you just pick yourself up and you get on with it.
Right.
And that was very, very useful, because that's a really good attitude to the world, let alone academics. And so I think that's one of the better mental things that sport can teach you. And it certainly, I think, is the reason why I suddenly lifted off. Yeah. I was to say also that Britain then turned into decimalisation. So then maths became, I was already there, whereas all the others had to change. So that was another thing that happened.
So you went to Oxford Uni, and then obviously you've had the amazing career that you've had in medicine. Can you talk a little bit about your interests, your diverse array of interests in karate and cycling and rock climbing and surfing and all the things you're into, and how do you fit all that into such a busy sort of schedule?
So I always think people who are busy are able to be more busy, and people who are not busy don't.
Yeah.
So that's the way I've done it. And I've always found when I was at school that sport was a good break from study, and sometimes study is a good break from sport, because otherwise you just worry about things too much. And so at school, I loved all the sports. But actually, strangely, my forte was golf. And I was a scratch golfer at 18. And so it was strange that a few years ago, I lectured to England Golf funny enough, St George's Park with their annual lecture before the Brazil World Cup.
Right.
Brazilian Olympics. And interestingly, Justin Rose won it. Nothing to do with me, but it was a nice coincidence.
Sure.
It was funny being at a football base to teach golf, but
Sure.
that came through that. And I've always followed the golf. And again, that's a very tactical thing, a very technical thing. Then after that, when I went to Oxford, I did a lot of rowing. Because of medicine being very, very busy, unless you drop out for a year, you can't really row in the main 8. But I was actually in the main squad and won the pairs championship and the singles championship whilst I was there.
Wow.
So that was quite good. And then when I started being a medical student, you couldn't really row regularly because a doctor, you couldn't really row regularly. And so I just had to find things which I could do at the odd weekend. So I started going to a climbing wall quite near where I was working in an indoor gym. And so I enjoyed it, met a couple of guys. We then would find if there was a weekend free, we would go off rock climbing and stuff. And then we ended up climbing some pretty massive things in the Pyrenees, 1,000-foot vertical walls and things like that.
And where you're sleeping in the tent, I don't know what the technical term is, but when you whack the tent up on the surface.
So those guys are usually aid climbing, but we were freestyling, but with a rope, which is where you don't leave anything in the rock. So the first guy puts it in, and the second guy coming up takes it out.
Right.
Yeah. So that's not free solo, which is without a rope, but it's still quite a nice way of moving. So the 2 of you move, or 3 of you move, where the last guy takes everything out and the first guy just puts in. And the things you put in, you have to find little cracks and stuff to put it in.
And that's 1,000 feet, you said?
Yeah, up to, yeah. But once you're over 50 feet, it doesn't matter. Because if you go from 50 feet or you go from 1,000 foot, it's finished. Yeah.
So, okay, so you were into the rock climbing, extreme rock climbing, I guess. Yeah. And then can you talk a little bit about your other, like karate, for example? So what made you
so my daughter decided to take up karate when she was about 6.
Right.
So she said, Dad, come along. So I thought, oh no. So I thought I'd better come along. And then actually I really enjoyed it because one of the things they had is that when you just think about fighting, it feels like there's nothing to it. You just beat the other guy up. But then karate broke it completely down.
The technical part of it.
The technical aspect.
Yeah.
And then also they have the belt system so that you might learn a simple punch and a simple block for your first belt and maybe certain stances. And then as it gets more and more evolved, then you learn more and more complex moves, individual moves. And then you learn more complex sequences of moves, which are called kata. And then you learn, do circuits punching against bags. And then you have sparring, which is just light contact. And then now and again, you would have pretty well full-on fights. But you learn that it's not you just go in and fight, that you're really understanding what the other person's trying to do, and also thinking about what techniques this person might be more vulnerable to. So that really got me into the idea of that any kind of sport can be broken down into specific techniques, that you start with the easiest ones, that you practice those easy ones, and then you bring in more complicated ones.
Which is, I guess, the genesis of how your relationship started and why you were interested in Coerver in terms of that sort of approach to football, which at the time and now was completely unique.
Yeah, so before I met Alf, my kids were doing football in grassroots, and I bought Make Your Move, which I think was one of the early Coerver books, because it just appealed to me that this is the move and this is something they can learn and my squad could learn, and we could work from that. So I was doing that, and of course there was a picture of Alf in the book. And then the day before the Champions League final between Manchester United and Barcelona.
2008 was
10.
Was that 10?
2000.
That great performance.
Yeah, 2010.
My daughter was having a tutorial in Wimbledon, so I dropped her off, and I thought, okay, I've got an hour. And I went into the newspaper shop and was about to pick the newspaper up to read about the Champions League. And then I'd actually got it in my hand. And then I thought, no, something better is going to happen. Put it down. So that's really strange. So I just thought I'd put it down. Walked out, and then the next thing I came to was Starbucks. I didn't know it was there, but I went in. And I was just ordering my coffee when Alf came in. And of course, I'd just seen him on the book. I hadn't seen anything else. And I kind of slightly tentatively said, sir, are you Alf Galustian? He said, yeah. He said, how do you know? And I said, I've got your book, Make Your Move. And I use that. It's really good. And so he said, sit down and have a coffee with me. So that's how we started. Yeah.
Fantastic, Pete. Well, I guess that brings us on to our topic today, which is a culmination of all those coffees that you've had all these years later. And if we get into sort of the topic and what we think is going to be useful in terms of the conversation with the actual listeners, and talk about the mental component in sport. And we've got a little bit of a presentation that will help guide us through it. So we're going to explain why sports, health and education go hand in hand. And I think that the important sort of, way to frame this conversation is how do we create the opportunity to turn a player into an elite athlete? This could be in football, this could be in tennis, etc. So, Dad, you've had experience in that, working at the academy level and with national federations. What are your observations in that step up from, advanced to elite?
Well, I think by the way, Pete forgot to tell you that he's a 7th Dan black belt. Is that?
So no, it's a second Dan.
So okay.
So scratch golfer, second Dan karate, advanced rock climber, and neuroscientist. I don't know why you're hanging around with us, the Galustians, Pete. But so now, what's your general observations before we get into the topic about that difference between advanced and elite?
Well, a little background. So we've been doing these podcasts with Arsene Wenger, and I've had the conversations with Pochettino and Ozzy Ardiles, and people that Jurgen Klinsmann, and all through my career with the big clubs. And a question kept coming up: how do you spot a player that's going to be a professional player? And for 40 years, with my friends and these podcasts, we were all scratching our head. I mean, we all agreed it couldn't be talent, because if you go to a professional club, you have to be talented. You have to be skillful. You wouldn't be at a professional club. But there were so few players making it that it had to be more than talent. And I think, again, going back to how Peter changed my thoughts on this subject, was that and we'll talk about it, the components of actually what a coach or a teacher has to learn and what a player has to learn then. It came pretty apparent to me. And, for example, the podcast with Arsene Wenger, we agreed it wasn't the talent. There had to be something else. And that something else was the mental component, which for the last 12 years I've been trying to learn from Peter.
Pete, anything to add to that? Is that how you saw it as well?
Yeah, that's pretty well how I saw it. So obviously, coming from a neurology point of view, we're really studying a lot the brain and how it goes wrong. So you get to realize how much the brain controls, and so many things that it does automatically, which you don't realize. So let's just say you pick a bag up in front of you. Obviously you feel you're using your arms. But before your arms have even moved, your muscles of your back have contracted so that you don't fall forward. And that's happened automatically. You've never thought, I have to get my back ready, then my hands. It just automatically happens. So the brain is so many times automatically firing in patterns, even before you actually make the move that you think you're making. Do you see?
Right.
And so seeing that was really important to me, to trying to understand how people were making moves in football.
Right. And I guess at that elite level, when you've got no space, you've got no time, everyone's world-class athletes, that has to be automatic.
Yeah.
There's no time for it to be thought of and deliberate.
Certainly in football, as you get older, space and time becomes less. So you've got the skill. You've got to perform skills in smaller spaces much quicker. So everything pointed at this what we've done in Coerver was build a huge curriculum of improving the individual game core skills, running with the ball, passing, shooting, shielding the ball. But in the end, you had to then do it at the right time, right place. And so again, we'd built this incredible library, which is available to all coaches and teachers. But once I met Peter, I spoke to Charlie. I said, "Look, we've got to look at re-examining the drill DNA. The drills that we give to young kids, and it has to incorporate decision making at the right time, right place." And so that was really important.
And traditionally, I guess, again, referring to football and how federations look at it, there's the four corners model, where you have technical, tactical, physical, mental. And you and Dr. Bain, I know in your conversations have been thinking about, is that the best way to think about things? Is there an opportunity to improve that model and how we think about that?
I think to qualify exactly, Peter and I have been discussing what is called the four cornerstones, technical, tactical, physical, and mental, which is global through FIFA, through UEFA. So it's a global way to teach. But we also, before that, agreed, and Charlie and I agreed 40 years ago, that our interest was really focused on two things. One is ages 6 to 16, so boys and girls 6 to 16, and so we thought, well, of course we're nowhere at Peter's academic level, but we thought that we had to follow the whole sort of academic teaching methods, like you go to kindergarten, then you go to primary school, then you go to high school, then you go to university. Let's say university for football is 17 to 21. So we focused on the age from 6, kindergarten to university, and I explained that to Pete, and we agreed on that. So that was a really important, caveat on what we're focusing on.
Right.
That, and the second thing was that our interest in the practice field, not the match. Now, I don't mean, of course, football's a competitive team game, and the objective of every competitive team game is to try to win. Of course, I understand that's important, but I know that Charlie and I's focus was the practice field. What could we devise on the practice field that would help coaches to work with players of all abilities? And so it goes, and then you've got to then go back to the four cornerstones, because there are only four sort of main topics in not only football coaching, I guess, or many different sports.
So why don't we focus firstly on the tactical element and your perspective, Dad, on this, and then we can go to Dr. Bain for what he thinks as well.
So I'm not dismissing this, but again, remember the age groups we're working with. So I think tactical success is largely dependent on the technical and mental abilities of the players and their physical capacity. Between 10 and 16, also Pete would describe it much better, but all sorts of physical things happen to the body. So I'm not dismissing the importance of tactics, and that every coach should understand them and learn about it, but they are dependent on the technical quality of the player and the physicality of the player,
and the mental qualities too, which I think we'll talk about in a minute.
Yes,
but,
yes.
So if we move on, I think that's done a good job of examining that.
Yeah.
Maybe Dr. Pete will throw this one over to you in terms of some of the physical. Traditionally, how we've looked in football at the physical part of the four corners
in these age groups, right?
Yeah. So I think that when the young players are there, like the very young, the 7 and 8 year olds, I think just turning up and running around is really the level. But they also do lots of little other things, like they do stop starts, automatically. They're beginning to learn how to turn. They're beginning to learn how to throw the ball in, obviously kicking the ball. I think one of the things that is really definitely true for them is they don't last very long. So you then have to break the sessions up into little bite-sized pieces that they can cope with. And then obviously with the physical side, as they get older, it becomes more important. I think really, when I think of the boys that I've coached over the 20 years, really they become interested in the physical side at about the age of 14. At that, they then start talking about things like bleep tests, your standing jump. They're beginning to think, actually, we can measure some of these things. And they're a bit interested how they are compared to others, and so that's quite good, because that starts giving them their own drive. But obviously, in elite institutes, they can measure absolutely everything, from the amount you're sweating, the amount you're breathing, your heart rate, how any thing you want to measure, that you breathe in or out. I've even seen at the European Congress of Sports Science that they had EEG recordings with electrodes on the brain done on 22 players playing 10 miles away from the clubhouse. And they were actually recording their brain waves as they were playing. So, I mean, the level you can go to in this is just unbelievable. Even in the Tour de France, when you watch them, they can give you each rider's heart strain index. So the heart shows strain, strangely, when it becomes more regular, when there's no chaos in the movement. And they can look at the variation in the heartbeat, and you should have some variation in the heartbeat. And as it gets less and less varied, it shows that the heart is under more strain. And so they even get a readout of the heart strain index on the riders in the team car as they're driving along. And the cyclists are, say, going up a mountain. So none of us would get up. So the detail that they get from that, and of course they have all the right things like training at altitude and the benefits that has for footballers, any athlete, in terms of being able to last for 90 minutes or whatever is necessary. So everything they can possibly do. Now they have the cryo chambers, so that afterwards you don't fatigue so much. The ice baths equivalent. And so the level now that they're getting to is just incredible. So every physical thing you can imagine.
Pete, I've got I'm and Coerver really interested in women's football, girls' football. What about there's obvious differences, but we talk about 6 to 16, and let's talk about the physicality. I think the skills are the same. I'm one of these people who believe that if the same skills program for boys and girls, 6 to 16 is fine. But then there is that physical aspect and the mental one, which we'll talk about, but the physical aspect.
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to that.
Yeah.
I think anybody who's coached a girls' side would say they're much more tactically aware from an earlier age. Mm. So if you ask one of them to play right back, they'll play right back. Whereas at an early age, the boys will just be all over the place. They just chase the ball. And so girls definitely pick up the concept of tactics and that they're part of a team structure. I would say probably 2 or 3 years earlier than boys. So they're really good on that. And as a result, they're a joy to coach. And also, if you suggest something to one of them, generally they will do it. Much more likely to do it than a boy will. So I think that is a real strength of the girls' game. But if you look at any Olympic records you want to look at, obviously the guys are stronger, faster, etc. When you go to endurance races, then the girls are coming back a bit. So it's not so obvious in endurance races, but there still is a little bit of an advantage for men. But on anything explosive, there is a big advantage. I think so. There's two sides, and there's a difference in kind of what you can do with a younger age group of girls, say age 11 or 12, than you can with boys.
Yeah.
So Pete, the grassroots team that I was telling you about, the under-10s, it's a mixed team. There's some female girl players and there's some boy players. And my observations of our training sessions are the starkest difference that one of the starkest differences is in attention.
Yeah.
So typically we'd start the session and I would have to say, okay, right, everyone, come in, let's get going. The girls are there in the first, let's get going.
Yeah.
The boys take 10 times basically to get their attention, to get them on the same page, to get them going.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a good segue to start talking about the mental component. But just to let you know, that was my my observation when you were
Yeah.
speaking about those differences in attention. It's just so apparent in our group.
Yeah, and they really all do it, don't they? You know, almost naturally. That straight away they're into the session the moment you ask them to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that is a good segue. So we've covered physical, we've covered tactical, we've talked about the technical.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the mental. So for the listeners that are just hearing us at the moment, we put up a slide where there is a rock climber. I don't think it's you, Dr. Pete, but it's someone probably with a very advanced skill level, and they're hanging kind of by a fingertip or two, upside down on a outreached piece of rock, and they're very high up. And we'll show the graphic to you, the listeners that are watching this on YouTube and video and stuff. So, Pete, can you talk a little bit about this picture and sort of what it says to you?
Yeah. So I think if any of you have watched Free Solo, the film, and you've seen the brilliant ascent of the Yosemite Valley El Cap without a rope, which was described, I think, correctly by other climbers as the climber either wins the Olympic gold or dies. It was literally that level of diciness, and I think anyone who watched it was literally gripping their own seat. But I think what that shows is that there are many climbers around the world who could do that grade of climb. So climbs are graded technically. Surprisingly, just like in karate, there are grades of moves similar with Coerver. So every climb, you would think every bit of rock you come across has actually, if it's been climbed, has got a grade. And even if it's a long climb, it's broken down into little sections, so you know where the hard sections are and things. And that's to stop a like average climber going off onto something really dangerous. So there's a good point to that. So there are a lot of other climbers who could climb that grade. Having said that, if 0 to 100% is the climbing grades, this was at about 95%. So it really was difficult. And the big difference was that in Free Solo, he can keep himself together. He can keep his head together when he knows a single mistake and he's dead. That is absolutely remarkable. But it does show how important it is that the mental side controls everything you can do. Now, I've seen guys who in climbing walls are brilliant. You know, you think, my God, why isn't this guy British champion or something like that? If they fall, they're onto big mats, so nothing's going to happen. They're not going to be hurt, you know. So it's all very, very safe. You put them on a difficult climb that's easier, quite a lot easier than what they're climbing in the gym, and they'll go halfway up and completely freeze, just cannot move. No, and it just shows the mind cannot cope with it. No. And so even though you can have really good technique, everything else can be perfect. If you don't have the mental control, then unfortunately you're not going to be able to perform at an elite level, because there the pressure is huge.
Do you think the most obvious example of that, Pete, in elite football is penalties, World Cup penalties? I think about Andrea Pirlo when he did the Panenka chip on his penalty versus England. I think that was in the Euro. I can't remember what game that was, but it was a high stakes game.
Yeah.
And he nonchalantly walked up, very calmly put the ball down, and his option to execute that very important penalty was to just do a little dink over the keeper who had dived to one side.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, with everything at stake, how has he had the confidence, the ability, the mental fortitude and strength to then execute it then?
Yeah.
And Zidane did it a couple of times. These players this, I'll do it.
Yeah. So I think that's an example of absolutely extreme pressure. You can't be under more pressure than that, you know. And I think when I think about the World Cup from England's point of view, we have the moment where Harry Kane is taking a penalty for the first time against France, against his club goalkeeper. Now, I have to say, it's easy to say afterwards, but I mean, as a friend of mine put it, if I had somebody taking a penalty to save my life, I would choose Harry Kane. You know?
Yeah.
No, and I think that's a reasonable point. But would you choose Harry Kane against your own club goalkeeper? And because of the fact that it adds in a whole load of extra psychological baggage. And I must say that that's just a question. I'm not saying obviously in hindsight it's easy, but it's just a question. And I think maybe had I been the coach, I would have asked someone else to take it. Both of them. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
This quote and this picture, I had the skills 100% wide. Only my mind can stop me.
Yeah. So he's basically saying, like, if you have the Coerver skills in football, in rock climbing, there are lots of specific hand grips, movements, and they all have different names, a bit like in football. And so he's saying, I've got everything I need technically to do this climb. But when I'm out there 1,000 foot off the ground, hanging on an overhang that's sticking 30 foot out from the rock with one finger, it's not my skills that are going to let me down. It's my head. Am I going to panic? Am I going to freeze? What happens if there's a surprise that I put my hand onto a rock and it's slippy? It's got a bird, something or other on it. So coping with something unexpected, and knowing that he's still going to be all right. Or say a piece of rock breaks off as he pulls on it. But a very advanced rock climber will know that, so he won't pull hard suddenly. He'll pull, check, put a bit of weight on. Is it going to hold? Do you think? So all these things, but that's because he can keep his mind together, absolutely stay in the zone, and knows he won't come apart. So I think that really is the thing. But you can't do that if you don't have the technique. It's not even on unless you have the technique. So the whole history of Coerver giving you the technique gives you the chance to do that. Yes. But whether you can in the end is whether your mind can cope with it. Yeah.
And then Pete, that's a really interesting opportunity to discuss how you guys are thinking about what the key mental components are then to help improve that. Yeah. Do you want to take this one, Dad, to start with, and then throw it over to Dr. Pete?
Yes. So the graphic shows 4 components that Peter and I designed, which was skill acquisition. How do you learn skills? Then perception, psychology, and social. So let me start with the skill acquisition, because the whole Coerver Foundation, and when Charlie and I started 40 years ago, we thought that this was the foundation that you built all other parts of the game on. So let's start just with the skill acquisition, and then I'll ask Pete some questions on it. So if people are interested in the Coerver Coaching Program, I'm sure they can go to our site and learn about, as I say, a curriculum. A curriculum is basically drills and games, and the Coerver method, that's a method is how you teach. So if you think a curriculum is what you teach and a method is how you teach, so we built up that library over 40 years. And I guess one of the things that when I met Pete, what I was really interested, is there any sort of science behind this? Because everything that Charlie and I did over the 40 years was intuitive, I think. We had no real clue why we were doing what we were doing, except a belief that we believed that ball mastery was a foundation, and you built everything on that. So just before Pete and I discuss the skill acquisition and namely Coerver, just a few definitions. So what does ball mastery mean? I'm saying ball mastery is the foundation of the game, and it's basically repeated manipulation of the ball. And for example, in Coerver, over 40 years, we've built over 150 different individual ball exercises that boys and girls can do. And we call that the ball mastery curriculum. And then what we then did was, in the way we devised how they were taught, in the drills we did, which went from repetition to complexity to speed of repetition, we found, I think we used a word called ball feeling, which Will Coerver actually, when we first met Will, he started using this word. And so what we found was that the more repetition you did with the Coerver, these 150 ball mastery exercises, the more you acquired what Will used to call ball feeling, which we now define that as an almost unconscious automatic comfort with the ball. So that the curriculum, if you repeated it and you repeated it in the right way, repetition and then complexity of repetition and speed of repetition, seemed to then wire this comfort with the ball. And that became the Coerver Foundation. And that foundation of that comfort with the ball actually improved all the what we call the game core skills. Receiving the ball, running with the ball, shooting, passing, the same technique, 1v1. That ball feeling actually improved all those essential game skills. And that's where Peter, when he came to one, I think it was at Fulham, he came to the first clinic. And after the clinic, there was about 120 coaches there, and we didn't have much time to talk, but it was the beginning of our weekly or regular coffee sessions. And he said to me, look, Alf, you've got some basic science behind what you're doing. And I said, come on, Pete, I've never really had a proper education, and football's all I know. And that was those 12 years. And then, of course, I've been learning from him to add to the DNA of the drills and games, and then finally the session plans that you put them in.
And I think what's kind of remarkable too, if you look back on the sort of amount of time you guys have been having this approach, all the best players, all the best teams in history, but currently, right now, need to have that automatic unconscious comfort on the ball. I mean, it's so apparent, such a prerequisite for all of the best players at the moment. I think it's also remarkable that you did kind of stumble upon it, because all of those guys have that at the moment.
Well, they do, but one of the things that and Pete and I joke about this, because if you look at the stats, and like I've always said, I advise everybody to do their coaching courses, and that they're excellent, from C license to pro license, E license to pro license. But when you look at the stats that are produced by the national federations, you'll see that on average, a player only has maybe 60 touches in 90 minutes. And so when we started Coerver, one of the criticisms is, what are you guys going on about ball mastery? But you have the ball 2 minutes in a 90-minute game. But it was Cruyff who actually said it, and then Charlie and I picked it up, was that, yeah, but without the ball, you can't score. And that's the game. And when you're defending, if you've got the ball, the other team can't score. So the statistics that they used to bash us with, well, ball mastery. What is all this ball mastery? Why do you need it? Because without it, 88 minutes. I think Charlie and I were right to pursue. I don't know, what do you think, Pete?
Yeah, I think you are. And I'll give you some examples from other sports. So firstly, my karate instructor, Sensei Frank Perry, who is 7th Dan and was head of British Karate for some time, he used to have us as black belt adults fighting 5-year-old girls who've never done karate. And he said the reason he wanted us to do that is he wanted us to keep the quality and speed of the movement, but tone it down so that there was no hit. We just touched the clothing. And he said that produces feeling when you're fighting. Now, if you think about a tennis game, you see Federer, Djokovic hitting this ball at phenomenal speeds, but all of a sudden, one of them would just do a little drop shot over the net and catch the other guy up. And that's the shot that has the ball feeling. You're saying, and that's what makes the difference. So in a sense, I think ball feeling is an ability to take the weight off the ball, the pressure off the ball, and cushion it in a very, very gentle way, but maintaining the quality of the whole movement. So that is very, very difficult. And I think that's what we really mean by ball feeling.
So, Pete, when you came to that Fulham course and you saw the drills, and I know when we went afterwards, and you said to me, look, the way you've devised these drills for the young players, where they repeat something and then you put, if you like, increasing difficulty. You make things more complex, you make it quicker. And you said to me, there's a basis of science. And my question then to you was, well, wow, how does the brain learn skills?
Yeah. So if you start with learning a simple skill, as you practice it, then gradually a code develops in the brain. And we call that an engram. So it's like a code for the movement. And as you practice it more and more, that code gets more and more hard wired into the brain. So say somebody plays the piano and they play a particular tune, the more and more they play it, the easier it is to play the tune. And then eventually they don't even need the music, they can just play the tune. So it's precisely like that. So as you learn a more complicated movement, then again, that gets created, and it would take more time if you're a beginner. Obviously, the more advanced you are, the easier you pick things up. But it's basically that creates a code or a little memory in the brain, so that when you want that skill, you can just produce it. You don't have to learn it again.
So, Pete, another question I have, and I know it's much more complex. The answer would be much more complex. But when we're talking about how does the brain learn skills, and then I get a bit confused. What's the difference between the brain and the mind?
Yeah. So the brain is the object. So you can have a brain in a jar,
Right.
in a museum, an anatomy museum, and that's still a brain. But the mind is the working of the brain, so how it works.
Okay.
So basically the thinking and all the things that it's doing unconsciously as well, like getting a muscle to work before you lift something up, all the unconscious things that is making you do, like breathe, and all this stuff. So the brain is active, and that's its working. So that's the mind. So the mind is the workings of the brain.
And so in Coerver, where we have this step-by-step teaching method, on the graphic over here, I see the analogy that you first told me 12 years ago about the car drivers.
Yeah, so I thought that was a good analogy, that say somebody first gets into a car and they've not driven, then they start looking at the clutch and the accelerator and the gears and things, and they're very unsure about these things. And often the instructor has dual controls because he knows he might need to do something. And so the first bit is just to get used to actual movements, the very simple movements for braking, accelerating, using the crutch, etc., and the gear changes. So that's the very beginning of learning. And then as the person gets better, then you hope that they're becoming more observant of the outside world, because now they don't have to look down at their foot when they use the clutch or down at the gear when they change gear. They can look out of the windscreen. And so then they're becoming a bit safer because they can drive through a street looking at what's going on. I still think they probably wouldn't pass, because I think where the driving instructors draw the line is when you're looking in your mirrors, you're checking your shoulder, you're becoming more aware of what's around you. So they want you to be able to control the vehicle physically, but they also really want you to have reasonable awareness of what's going on. So I think those are the two things. But obviously that doesn't make you a racing driver. So it's one thing going down a high street at 20 miles an hour, but say you're doing 220 miles an hour coming into a corner, that's a different story. And so in order to drive like a racing driver, you've got to practice at speed, because again, the timing of everything changes. So the timing of where you brake going into a corner, coming in at 220 as opposed to 20 miles an hour, is completely different. And so practicing in a racing car at high speed then begins to sharpen those skills up so that you can be a racing driver. On the other hand, if you were a taxi driver driving around London, that's great, but I don't think you would give Hamilton a run for his money on a track.
Yeah. So in a way, this so in Coerver, when we design our drills, we do it with planned, deliberate practice of increasing difficulty.
Yeah.
And Professor Erickson, who I admire very much, an author of the book that described the 10,000 hours of practice, he had data proving that this planned, deliberate practice of increasing difficulty was the road to excellence.
Yeah.
You've described it in the car analogy between learning how to drive and then becoming a racing car driver, which we reflect in the Coerver drills. But the other thing that I was very interested in is how you explained why this works, and you described it as a process of myelination, and we see in the graphic the juggler.
Yeah.
Can you explain how then that works in the brain?
Yeah. So in the brain, you create circuits.
Okay.
So there are circuits within the brain, and the brain cells are linked. So there are around about 86 billion nerve cells in the brain. So there's a lot of them. And they're interlinked, and obviously the pathways that come down to your arms and legs for movement and for feeling and other things. And when you do something at an ordinary pace, you develop the engram, the memory of it. But as you do things quicker and quicker, and you're using that circuitry, then the nerves that interconnect between the nerves in the brain, and then from the brain to the muscles, they become more myelinated. So a myelin is a sheath that covers the nerve, and it affects the way that the nerves conduct, the way they conduct. And when a nerve becomes myelinated, the speed of nerve conduction jumps up hugely. So instead of conducting at, say, 5 meters a second, it then conducts at 50 or 60 meters a second. So it becomes much, much quicker. Now, if you take the example of a juggler, if you juggle one ball, which probably most of us can do, it will be fairly slow, but the timing will be appropriate to that. The moment you add in another ball, then you've got to change your timing again. And so you then have to speed up. If you practice that a lot, then you'll partly myelinate your tracks. If you then add in 3 balls, then you're going to have to speed up more. The timing changes. You're going to have to myelinate quicker. And then as you go up towards the world record of 13 or 14 balls, then your hands are going to have to really start moving. So the whole chain, although it's the same movements, the timing of the movements is changing each step up. And so when you learn a skill in Coerver, as you put more and more stress on the skill, say coming up to a better and better defender, then the timing of those movements have to become much quicker, and you've then got to have a myelinated system. So as you do that gradual increasing difficulty, increasing speed work with the players, then their brains, the circuitry involved, are becoming more myelinated. And interestingly, when something is myelinated, you see that the person can do something like juggling faster, but you also see that they can do it smoother. So that smoothness that we were talking about is part of that.
Pete, is there a transfer too to something that's connected? So maybe not in the juggling example, but for example, someone that has good hand-eye coordination, how they could pick up a cricket bat and be good at cricket, or pick up a tennis racket and be good at tennis, or better at tennis than maybe another beginner would be. Is there a sort of cross transfer of that myelination? Possibly.
Yeah, so I think there is, but I kind of go with Boris Becker on this. So he was asked when he'd won Wimbledon, I think for the second time, why the British guys were not winning Wimbledon. I think we went for a very bad run from someone like Fred Perry until Andy Murray went, at Wimbledon, and he was renowned for his ferocious serve. And he said, but I practice my serve 200 times a day. And he said, you were talking about why the British players are having their serve broken. And he said, they don't have a serve. There's nothing to break. In other words, they weren't really myelinated. They really weren't grooved. I think the golfers call it grooving of the swing, things were really neatly grooved. And he could rely on it because it was really automated. Yeah. And once it's so automated, you can then add in something else, which you can make very fine variants on it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And then you're becoming even better. Yeah. So I think his point really stood out to me at the time as showing the importance of repeated practice.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, Pete, this graphic, which you and I think mostly you constructed, which we call the Coerver Coaching Engine of Learning.
Yeah.
This was, the podcast that I had with Arson and with the late Gerald Houllier, my dear friend, and Roy Hodgson, trying to figure out how do you get excellence. Can you just explain what our engine of learning is?
Yeah. So our engine of learning is based on a spiral. And actually that's something strangely that I've done a lot of work on in neurology. And the reason is it's very good for recording people's tremors. If they draw a spiral and they have a shape, you see it quite well in the spirals. And there's actually a rating scale used all around the world based on spirals called the Bain spiral
After you.
scale. Yeah, after me. And that's used literally all around the world. And the other thing that is interesting about spirals is something you might have noticed if you've ever stopped in a motorway and decided to get rid of a coin that you don't want, like a 1 cent coin or something like that. And you put it in this little machine, and it goes in and goes round and round and round and round. And then as it goes down, it goes faster and faster and faster, and then down the hole in the bottom. Yeah. So it was really making me think about how, as you learn, you can get faster and faster and faster, and as you get better and better, as the coin went down. So we devised this spiral of learning, and it was really about how you learn things. So say you learn a skill. I think typically the young player sees it first, so they perceive it. So they might see it on Match of the Day, they might see it on a video, they might see another player do it, or they might be at a football ground and actually see a professional player make that move. So they see the move. So the next thing they do is practice the move. But they practice the move and they kind of get it a bit, but it doesn't look great. And nearly always after that, they go and look back at somebody good at the move, just to see whether they're getting it right in order to refine it. And then they practice it again. So you get this spiral happening of first looking, then practicing, then improving, and then repeating that process as you go down. And each time, if you're a probably elite player, you might even look at the video of yourself and think, oh, I could do this a bit better. So your coaches might be showing you that you could make this movement a little better, and they might say someone else, look at how the way he does it. Yeah. So as you learn, is that kind of constant spiral of refining that's going on from the original learning that move, which is pretty cumbersome, and then gradually improving it as you go along.
That perceiving bit, Pete, I guess historically before technology and online, etc., and gaming would have to be done in a live setting. So I'd watch you do it, and and I know there's some research around this now online. So kids playing FIFA on the PlayStation or watching YouTube videos of Messi consistently, that can help aid. In addition to the sort of live stuff that they have to do, the work with the ball, that can also aid that particular part of that stage of development, right?
Yeah, I think it or
potentially.
Yeah, definitely can. Yeah, I think definitely can. And I think there's an even more basic point there. And I actually saw this when we were at a campsite in Spain. We were surfing actually, and they had a futsal court, and my kids were I think they're about 7 and 4. And they went out there onto the futsal court, and immediately loads of people turned up, little kids play out. And very big range, from 14 to like 4 or so. And I was watching the different nationalities and the way they behave. So these little Spanish 5-year-olds were coming up to my young son saying, triangulation. We want you to be in triangle so we can play in triangles. Yeah. So look for the triangles. Now, I thought, wow, not one British kid ever born would have said that. Do you see what I mean? But that's what they had picked up from watching Spain, watching
Xavi, Iniesta.
And I just thought, wow, so that point's huge. I really do. And I was watching a couple of the German kids, and they were very fit, quite technical, you might argue box to box, great endurance, great mental strength, etc. Yeah. And I thought, wow, it's amazing. These national characteristics are there at 5 and 6.
Because of how they experience football, consume, watching their local stuff. Yeah, that's interesting.
And so, Pete, it moves us on then with once you go through the Coerver curriculum and the Coerver method, and you hardwire the skills, essential skills in football you need, running with the ball, 1v1, passing, receiving the ball, to play the game well. It kind of opened up more space for what is absolutely necessary to play the game effectively and well, is to make good decisions.
Yeah.
And the slide shows the brain and the link between learning the skill and decision making?
Yeah. So we could go into the brain and the way it makes decisions, but that's very, very complicated.
Yeah.
But what I would say is when you have learned a skill very, very well, you don't have to think about that skill at all. So it frees a larger area of the brain to concentrate on actually what you want to do in the external world. So say you're driving and you know you have to change gear. I don't think you even think, you just do it. Don't. Say you're learning to drive and you have to change gear. That takes your concentration out of the windscreen, out of what's outside. And so as a result, I think by having those skills wired, being able to produce them quickly, it buys you not only time, but it also frees the brain up to actually be perceiving what's going on.
So decision making, without becoming too technical, Pete, is there a part of the brain that?
So there is a critical area of the brain, but in fact many things are involved. Almost your whole experience is involved in a decision. It sounds strange, as like your cultural way you're brought up in football. Do you see?
Yes.
So it's a very long story, but there is an area of the brain at the front of the brain, and there's an area just above the nose called the orbitofrontal cortex, and basically that tells you your reward you would get. So let's say you're going to put some money on the lotto. It's saying you could win £1 million. Now, there's an area just above it, the ventrolateral prefrontal part of the brain, where it tells you why and what are the risks. Do you see? So instead of putting all your money on the lotto, it's saying this is great, I could win billions of pounds. It's saying no, don't, because what happens if you lose? Do you know? So those two areas are very critical. In fact, if the area just above the nose, the orbitofrontal area, is damaged, the person lives in a total state of apathy and unable to make decisions. So they are critical. But in fact, vast areas of the brain are involved in decisions at the actual time.
So this leads us into the topic that the last, I think, 6 months we've been talking about. And Arsene Wenger actually put me onto this topic about 2 years ago, where just before he left Arsenal, he had contacted the Norwegian School of Sports Science, and this was about the topic of scanning. And this picture I like very much. It's Dennis Bergkamp. Arsene used to say Dennis was probably one of the most professional players he'd coached. And Dennis is saying behind every kick of the ball, there has to be a thought. And so the topic of scanning, which I think is very important for not only coaches, but I think for parents or fans, and certainly players to understand. Let's talk a little bit about that. So we talked about a little bit about the areas of the brain that you're using. So scanning is basically looking around to make decisions. And if you go through the steps, what steps would you have? Do you go through when you make a decision?
Yeah. So let's start with traditional football, because it actually relates to this very well.
Yeah.
So the first thing, let's say a kid sees, is the ball coming towards them. So they have to see it. So they have to perceive that that's going. It may be that they hear something or feel something, but let's just say the ball's coming to them. They see the ball. So that's perception. The second thing is they got to think, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to let the ball go past me? Am I going to stop it? Am I going to kick it? So they're actually thinking, what do I do with the ball? And then the third thing is they then have to make a decision. This is the decision that I've made. And then they've actually got to do it. Like, am I going to kick the ball? Am I not going to kick the ball? Am I going to do a skill? What am I going to shoot, cross, whatever? So that's really the sequence in making a decision. And in a way, that's how traditionally football's coached. So if you to get your grassroots player and you teach them about receiving the ball, then get your head up, look around, and then make a decision, and then play the ball. Actually, I think nearly every coach would be very, very happy with that. And that's really the traditional way football's been taught. And also, if you listen to commentators on football, that's very much the way they think as well. So that's the kind of model of how you want to bring up a player, or was. But I think that may have changed. So we'll go into that.
Yes, and let's talk about scanning and let's define it. So we're defining it basically as the 10 or 12 seconds before the player receives the ball. And what to scan is, well, they're scanning their teammates, like you've said, they're the ball, the opponents, the space, and they're taking information, as I understand it, through the eyes. So that's the definition of not. I'm sure not a scientific one, but I think a generally acceptable definition. If we go on to the next one. So when Arson told me about this, I looked into it and looked into data, and I would advise, and I'm sure Pete would agree with me, that all coaches, all teachers should consistently look for updated data on whatever their interest is. And so I looked up this expert on scanning, Dr. Jordat from the Norwegian School of Sports Science. And he began in 1998 looking at players and making decisions. And he started off with his PhD students, with one camera following one player. And over the years, this is, over 20 years of study, the sophistication of the cameras. They had one camera that could pick up everything, and of course was analyzed through the computers, etc. And in 2013, he actually looked at 100 English Premier League players through filming them, and then through looking at where the eyes were actually scanning to. And he came up with his conclusions. And I've picked the two top ones, Steve Gerrard and Frank Lampard. They had in his study 6 scans, 6 looks in the 10 seconds before they received the ball. And interestingly, sometime later, I was looking at another study, not with Jordat, but of Xavi, the great Spanish player, who had a phenomenal 8.6 scans in 10 seconds. Now, what the science behind that, maybe you'd tell us, but this work about scanning was so important, I think, that it influenced what we did in our drill design. In other words, his conclusions that there was a link between the number of scans and the effectiveness of the players, especially for the players that scanned the most, looked the most, were the most successful in retaining the ball possession, were the most successful in what we call the killer pass, the forward pass. So that was the that's what I want to talk to you about.
Yeah.
So, Peter, so if scanning means looking at deciding really what to do before and after you get the ball, right? And you made a very interesting series of graphs showing or illustrating the difference between the scanning, i.e. the decision making, the looking, between grassroots players and elite players. Would you explain these?
Yeah. So if we go to the traditional way of coaching, the ball arrives and the player receives and controls. Now, obviously, the better the player, the quicker that's done. But in grassroots, that might take a second or two even to do that. Then they look up, and if it's a young player in a grassroots club, that's great. They look up, they think what's on, they make a decision, and then they play, shoot, cross, run with the ball, use the skill, whatever. So that's the usual sequence. But if you scan, it potentially changes the sequence and speeds up the way you play dramatically. So if you look around before the ball arrives rather than after you've got it, and you scan, let's say you were Xavi, you've scanned 8 times in 10 seconds, which is actually an incredible physical feat, let alone psychological feat. When the ball comes and you're receiving the ball, you know already what you want to do. So that allows the ball to come to you and you just play a first-time touch. So the ball is with you and gone in an instant. And then it's off to the next player. And then they can do the same thing. And so when you scan, you can move the decision making into the period before the ball arrives. And then if you do want to control the ball, you already know what move you want to make when the ball arrives. So you're ahead of already in the motor movement of that. If you want to just play it first time, you already know where the player is. And I think your point earlier in the game of the goal that Messi made in the World Cup, where he cut in field from the sort of right-hand side of the pitch. And he had obviously seen his colleague on the right-hand side of the penalty area. But he actually, because of that, deliberately moved left to drag the defence left, to give that player more room, and looked deliberately left, away from that player, because he knew where he was and the trajectory having scanned, and then play the perfect ball. So that was an absolutely beautiful instance of not only had he scanned, he had worked out exactly where the guy was, how fast he was travelling. And because he knew that already, he was able to make his movement as a decoy and actually improve the opportunity with the ball before he played the pass. So that was a beautiful example of how scanning affected his receipt and movement.
That disguise too was, I can't remember seeing another pass like it.
Yeah.
How he completely disguised it. The only comparison I thought of when watching it was, you know how Magic Johnson in basketball, they get into the D area near the basket, and he'd do the no-look pass, look that way and pass it off over there, in and amongst, through his opponents. I can't remember another pass that's similar. I don't know if you can think about watching football, Dad, over the years, but that was just magical, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And
absolutely magical.
Yeah, and the way, because he had scanned, he was able to manoeuvre the whole defence.
Yeah, to go with him.
Yeah, whereas instead of like a good ordinary player, even a good elite player, would have received the ball, made a touch, looked up, chances over. You know, because he was ahead of the actual receipt. Yeah.
And now, people, is there a difference between the grassroots player and the elite player vis-a-vis scanning and decision making?
So I think that it's something that up to now has never been coached at grassroots level. I really do. And I think it is such a fundamental quality to playing football very well that I really do think it should be brought in at a very early age.
Right.
And it may even help the kind of tactical side and formation side, because once people start looking around instead of just at their own feet and the ball, then it begins to open the whole game up. And so it might create, if we could get this in early, even in a beginning way or a little way, that this might really aid the player's development as a tactical player as well. And so I do think that it should be put in the very fundamental part of coaching of children.
Yeah, so I think in Madrid in December, Pete, we put on a field session, which we had devised actually drills that actually helped this scanning process. Yeah,
and I remember one of the drills where we just had 4 players on each corner of a 10-yard box passing the ball across to each other.
Right.
So A would pass across the square to B, C would play across the square to D. So they're playing back and forth. And we had 4 players behind them. And originally with cones, so they might have a red cone in one hand and a blue cone in the other.
Yeah.
And originally we made them scan every 10 seconds.
Yeah.
So I would shout behind you, and they'd have to look at which colour cone was held before they played the ball.
Yes.
And we could originally do that with 2 touch. If you wanted to then do it with 1 touch, you could speed it up.
Yeah.
You know. So we do that. And then we could shout right or left. So they had to scan left, right, and in front. So, and we had different colour cones. And again, they had to shout the colour of the cone the guy holding to their left was holding.
Before receiving, or they trap the ball and then they're looking?
Before receiving, as the ball was receiving. And then we changed it so that we put the cones down, and the guy behind the player, so the guys on the outside, came either onto the right shoulder or the left shoulder as the ball was coming. And then the player had to look round, see which shoulder, and take the ball away from that direction and play it back. And so we're then making it more game realistic. But that was to show the basis of scanning. Yeah. Right. And what was interesting is, first, with some pretty good players out there, we were doing it once every 10 seconds. So I was waiting 10 seconds. And they seemed to be able to control that. We then went to twice in 10 seconds. They were really struggling with time.
Yeah.
You think about it 8 times in 10 seconds. I mean, you're going, look, 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 look. Yeah. I mean,
remarkable.
yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? So the one thing it taught me is that in order to scan, you've really got to practice the neck movement. I mean, all of you after this podcast, go outside, look behind your shoulder once every 10 seconds, then twice every 10 seconds, and then try and do a Zavi and look around 8 times in 10 seconds and see how you feel.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not an easy thing. It really isn't. It's an elite movement in itself.
Well, I've got to say, since that last December, I've worked on, I think it's about 55. We've come up with 55 new Coerver scanning drills for boys and girls, which we're going to try out. But it's just added another element to our drill DNA and our planning, session planning.
All right, guys. Well, I think that's us wrapped up. Dr. Pete, thanks very much for your time today. Dad, you too. And hope all the listeners have enjoyed today's conversation.